Mistake number one, overthrowing Iran's democracy and buying 70 years of consequences for $100,000. In 1953, the CIA spent approximately $100,000 in bribes to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. The British were furious that Mossadegh had nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which had been controlled by a British company, and approached the CIA with a straightforward proposal: help us remove him. The CIA obliged. Operation Toppled organized street protests, paid mobs, bribed military officers, and planted anti-Mossadegh stories in Iranian newspapers. The coup worked. The Shah returned. Oil profits flowed back to British and American companies. CIA Station Chief Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, later wrote a memoir about it called Countercoup. He was quite proud of himself. Here is what the $100,000 actually purchased: the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, the 444-day hostage crisis, 70-plus years of extraordinarily hostile relations between Iran and the United States, Iran's nuclear program, and the entire downstream architecture of modern Middle Eastern politics that governments are still trying to untangle. The CIA didn't formally acknowledge its role until 2013, 60 years after the fact. No one was prosecuted. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. retired comfortably. Cost to consequence ratio: $100,000 spent. Roughly 70 years of geopolitical catastrophe purchased. If this were a business investment, it would be studied in MBA programs as the single worst return in the history of American foreign policy. Mistake number two, funding the Mujahideen and accidentally constructing the Taliban. In the 1980s, the CIA ran one of the largest covert operations in its history, Operation Cyclone. The goal was simple: arm, fund, and train Afghan Mujahideen fighters to bleed the Soviet military in Afghanistan and force a withdrawal. It worked. The Soviets left in 1989. The CIA considered it a major success and moved on. What the CIA did not particularly plan for was what happened after the Soviets left. The training infrastructure, the weapons networks, the organizational frameworks, and the ideological foundation built during Operation Cyclone didn't dissolve. They were inherited by the Taliban, by Al-Qaeda, and by a Saudi construction heir named Osama bin Laden, who had been welcomed into the Mujahideen network with CIA-adjacent support and funding. The CIA spent approximately $3 billion on Operation Cyclone. The United States then spent over $2 trillion in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021, fighting the exact organizations that grew from the infrastructure it built in the 1980s. The Taliban retook Kabul in August 2021, 20 years after being removed from power, in some cases carrying weapons that trace back to American supply chain. A CIA officer who worked Operation Cyclone was once asked whether the agency regretted not planning for the post-Soviet period. The answer, paraphrased from multiple accounts, that was someone else's problem to handle. It became everyone's problem for 4 decades, and it is still not resolved. Mistake number 3, the Bay of Pigs, or how to invade Cuba and fail at everything simultaneously. In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. Approximately 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles were landed on the Cuban coast with the expectation that it would trigger a popular uprising against Castro and topple his government. The plan failed in almost every possible dimension. It was not a surprise. Cuban intelligence had been tracking the training operation in Guatemala for months. The airstrikes intended to destroy Castro's air force were scaled back at the last minute because the Kennedy administration worried about how it would look, and the air force was not destroyed. The landing site was changed from a location with jungle cover to an open beach that offered none. The promised American air support never materialized. The expected popular uprising did not happen. Within 72 hours, 1,200 of the 1,400 invaders had been captured. The operation cost approximately $46 million. The United States then spent an additional $53 million in food and medicine to ransom the captured fighters back from Cuba. Castro, rather than being overthrown, emerged from the Bay of Pigs more popular domestically than he had been before the invasion. The CIA's internal postmortem identified the core problem with brutal clarity. The entire operation was built on the assumption that Cubans would spontaneously rise against Castro once the invasion began. There was no reliable intelligence supporting this assumption. It was essentially wishful thinking in operational planning documents. And the consequences didn't stop there. The failure convinced Soviet Premier Khrushchev that Kennedy was weak, a miscalculation that contributed directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. The crisis that nearly ended the world traced, in part, to a botched CIA beach landing. Mistake number 4, MK Ultra, or spending 20 years, failing to control human minds. From the early 1950s through the 1970s, the CIA funded MK Ultra, a covert research program to develop mind control techniques using LSD, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and psychological torture. The stated goal was to extract information from enemy agents and alter human behavior on demand. This was considered, internally, to be a reasonable use of government resources. The results, after 2 decades and an estimated $10 million across at least 150 separately funded research projects, they could not control human minds. What they could reliably do was cause severe and lasting psychological damage to the American citizens, mental patients, prisoners, and soldiers who were dosed without their knowledge or consent. Frank Olson, a CIA scientist, was secretly dosed with LSD at a work retreat in 1953. Days later, he fell from the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The government called it suicide. His family called it something else. When his body was exhumed in 1994, forensic evidence suggested he had been knocked unconscious before going through the window. The case was never prosecuted. When a Senate committee investigated in 1977, the CIA director acknowledged the program had existed, but noted that most of the documents had been ordered destroyed in 1973 by the previous director. The files that survived were discovered only because a government archivist misfiled a box that wasn't searched in the document purge. 20 years of research. An unknown number of American citizens experimented on without consent. Scientific conclusion: mind control doesn't work the way the CIA hoped. No criminal charges were filed. The Senate held hearings. This was apparently sufficient. Mistake number 5. Aldrich Ames, or employing the CIA's biggest traitor for 9 uninterrupted years. Aldrich Ames was a CIA officer who, beginning in 1985, began selling the names of every Soviet agent working for the CIA to the KGB. He continued doing this for 9 years. He was paid approximately $4.6 million. He spent the money on a $540,000 house, paid for in cash, a Jaguar, and a lifestyle dramatically inconsistent with a mid-level government salary. At least 10 CIA assets in the Soviet Union were executed as a direct result of Ames's betrayal. Dozens of intelligence operations were compromised. An entire generation of CIA knowledge about Soviet intentions and capabilities was burned. For almost a decade, the KGB knew exactly what the CIA knew, which also meant they knew what the CIA didn't know and could act on both. CIA counterintelligence noticed the losses. They ran internal investigations. They looked directly at Ames. They noted that his finances appeared dramatically inconsistent with his salary. And then, for several more years, they did not arrest him. He was eventually caught not through brilliant intelligence work, but because the FBI got involved and conducted the kind of sustained financial investigation the CIA had failed to complete. Ames was arrested in 1994. The total damage from his 9-year betrayal has never been fully calculated because the CIA still does not know the complete scope of what he gave away. Mistake number 6. Bombing the Chinese embassy and blaming outdated maps. On the night of May 7th, 1999, during NATO's air campaign against Yugoslavia, 5 American guided bombs struck a building in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese journalists and wounding 20 others. The building was the Chinese embassy. The CIA's official explanation: the agency had been using an outdated map and had incorrectly identified the building as a Yugoslav Federal Procurement Office. The correct address for the target was in one database. The Chinese embassy's current address was in a different database. The 2 databases were not cross-referenced before 5 precision munitions were dropped on a diplomatic mission of the People's Republic of China. China did not accept the map explanation and has never fully accepted it. Anti-American protests erupted across China. The United States paid $28 million in compensation to the Chinese government and $4.5 million to the families of the 3 journalists killed. The CIA officer responsible for the targeting was fired, one of the genuinely rare cases in this entire list where anyone faced any professional consequence at all. What makes this particular failure remarkable is not that it involves sophisticated tradecraft or complex geopolitical miscalculation. The CIA bombed a foreign embassy because it did not have an accurate, up-to-date street address for the target city. In the middle of an active air campaign in a capital city, the world's most sophisticated intelligence agency, with an annual budget in the tens of billions of dollars, did not cross-reference 2 address databases before authorizing an airstrike. Mistake number 7, the Iraq WMD assessment, or the $2 trillion intelligence failure. In October 2002, the CIA produced a national intelligence estimate, concluding that Iraq possessed chemical and biological weapons and was actively pursuing nuclear capability. This assessment was presented to Congress, to the United Nations, and to the American public as the core justification for the invasion of Iraq. The assessment was wrong. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The nuclear program that Colin Powell described to the UN Security Council in February 2003 in a presentation based substantially on CIA intelligence with visual aids did not exist in the form described. Powell later called the presentation a blot on his record. The CIA called it an analytical failure. The invasion proceeded regardless. The war lasted officially until 2011 and continues in various forms today. The United States spent approximately $2.1 trillion. Estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths range from 150,000 to over 600,000, depending on methodology. The collapse of the Iraqi state created the power vacuum that produced ISIS, which required an entirely separate military campaign. More years, more casualties, more spending to partially address. Post-invasion investigations found that CIA analysis had been shaped by political pressure, that analysts had been pushed toward conclusions supporting a predetermined policy outcome, rather than being permitted to assess independently. Analysts who raised doubts found their doubts excluded from the final product. CIA Director George Tenet called the WMD case a slam dunk. He later received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. No senior official was prosecuted for the failure or its consequences. Mistake number 8. Robert Hanssen, the spy who mocked his own agency. For 22 years, Robert Hanssen was an FBI counterintelligence officer, a man whose professional purpose was detecting and catching spies, who spent 22 years selling secrets to Soviet and then Russian intelligence. What he gave away included CIA asset identities, classified nuclear war planning, American surveillance capabilities, and the location of a secret NSA tunnel dug under the Soviet embassy in Washington specifically to intercept communications. The tunnel had cost tens of millions of dollars to construct. Russian intelligence learned about it from Hanssen almost immediately. It was essentially useless for its entire operational lifespan. The CIA and NSA believed they were collecting intelligence from it. They were collecting whatever the Russians decided to let them collect, which is a different thing entirely. Hanssen was not identified through counterintelligence. The FBI eventually purchased a file from a Russian source, reportedly for $7 million, that contained Hanssen's fingerprints. He had been operating since 1979. He was arrested in 2001. In the intervening 22 years, he had sent anonymous taunting letters to his KGB handlers, explicitly noting that he had never been caught, and expressing confidence that he never would be. He wrote the letters. He was not caught because of the letters. This speaks to certain limitations in the counterintelligence process.